Good day, everyone. This talk is on the subject of the spiritual evolution in the Aquarian age. In a recent New York Times opinion column, staff writer Russ Douthat made some striking observations about some of the illusionary changes we are facing. He spoke mostly about the effect of technological, especially the digital revolution, that he thinks is creating something that evolutionary biologists refer to as a bottleneck, a period of rapid pressure that threatens cultures, customs, and peoples. Although there are unwarranted speculations and questionable, unstated assumptions in this article, the author made some very striking points, such as when he says, for, quote, anything that you care about, from your nation to your worldview, to your favorite art form, to your family, the key challenge of the 21st century is making sure that it's still there on the other side. He notes that much of this process of destruction seems voluntary, but in actuality is simply distracting us from the activities that sustain ordinary life by drawing people out of the real and into the virtual. His main point is, in this environment, survival will depend on intentionality and intensity. Any aspect of human culture that people assume gets transmitted automatically without too much conscious deliberation is what online slang calls NGMI, not going to make it. Mr. Douthat's exhortations are meant to be, as he says, quote, an appeal for intentionality against drift, for purpose against passivity, unquote. This latter statement is what particularly interests us in our discussion of spiritual evolution in the Aquarian age, because we know that a foundational principle of the wisdom religion is that human beings hold the keys to their own growth. HPB makes reference to this idea in her presentation of the three fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine, particularly the third, in which she says that through the cycle of incarnation or necessity, in accordance with cyclic and karmic law, no purely spiritual buddhi or divine soul can have an independent conscious existence before the spark which issued from the pure essence of the universal sixth principle, or the oversoul, has A, passed through every elemental form of the phenomenal world of that manvantara, and B, acquired individuality, first by natural impulse, and then by self-induced and self-devised efforts, checked by its karma, thus ascending through all the degrees of intelligence, from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral and plant, up to the holiest archangel, or Dhyani Buddha. The pivotal doctrine of the esoteric philosophy admits no privileges or special gifts in man, save those won by his own ego through personal effort and merit throughout a long series of metempsychoses and reincarnations. Several points are germane here. First, Madame Blavatsky is describing a very long arc of human evolution, primarily spiritual and psychic, but also including physical evolution. Given the logic of HPB's statement of that evolutionary pilgrimage, we are led to state several other postulates. Number one, If there has been an evolution of spirit into matter, there must be an evolution of spirit out of matter. Number two, if the descending arc of evolution is compared philosophically to the one becoming the many, then the ascending arc may be viewed as the many re-becoming the one. Number three, the evolutionary impulse behind spirit, that is consciousness, has now shifted from an involution into matter to an evolution out of matter. And number four, the central task in this phase of the evolutionary cycle is to restore individual monastic initiative. In relation to postulate number one, the descent of spirit into matter and the evolution of spirit out of matter is a pivotal concept. In the Secret Doctrine, HPB explains this dual process of both involution and evolution. As the spirit, or the original primordial unity, descends into matter, becoming increasingly material until it reaches the densest state, it is also seemingly fragmented into a multiplicity of beings at many levels of matter and consciousness. When the descent of consciousness and differentiation of matter and form reach its most extreme condition, the process reverses itself to now become the evolution of spirit out of matter, with the ascent of consciousness towards a unitary state of being and the dissolving of the differentiations of matter and form, returning both spirit and matter back to their original spiritual state of primordial unity and homogeneity, along with the inconceivable wisdom gained from the experience of all beings over the entire Manvantara. Thus, the one re-becomes the solitary self that retires into its parent source for an equivalent number of ages until the process of manifestation has begun again. The dynamics of this evolutionary process depend upon two primary forces, as HPB explains in the Secret Doctrine. Quote, "We are taught that the transformations through which man passed on the descending arc, which is centrifugal for spirit and centripetal for matter, and those he prepares to go through henceforward on his ascending path, which will reverse the direction of the two forces, viz., matter will become centrifugal and spirit centripetal. In other words, the two forces, centrifugal for spirit and centripetal for matter, operating during the involutionary phase, change places at the midpoint of the evolutionary phase to become centripetal for spirit and centrifugal for matter. The midpoint of evolution was marked by several important events in the life of the human host: the full incarnation into physical vestures, the separation of the sexes into male and female, the connecting up of the lower vestures with the higher faculties, called the lighting up of manas, the activation of the power of speech, and the manifestation of the full set of five senses. When that midpoint of evolution was reached and the evolutionary centrifugal and centripetal forces changed places, the human host began to readjust its comprehension of the environment in which it existed. But why does this matter? It matters simply because during the involutionary phase, the host of of monads was virtually carried along by the evolutionary currents by natural impulse, without having to exert themselves self-consciously to participate in the evolutionary pilgrimage. They were being carried along without having to sign on to the whole enterprise. As Professor Raghavan Iyer explains in his essay, Spirit, Mind, and Matter, quote, "During the descending cycles of manifestation, spirit works centrifugally by diffusion of light in every direction. Matter, on the other hand, works by concentration and condensation, becoming harder and denser and absorbing into itself various essences. This process confuses human beings. They experience a distinct gap between spirit and matter, are seemingly caught in what is purely the shadowy side or external aspect of nature. But having passed the midpoint at which astral potentials are merged into physical forms, humanity is moving towards a comparable future point when physical existence will dissipate and evaporate through a re-merging into a subtle substance. On the ascending arc of the process, matter will become what spirit was. Matter will become more etherealized, looser, and less concrete. It will begin to etherealize itself. Spirit, on the other hand, will be characterized by greater freedom in inner concentration. As spirit is freeing itself from confinement in the grossest matter, while matter is etherealizing itself, consciousness is becoming more individuated on the plane of ideation, yet more universal in its sentient contact with all of manifestation. Spirit is drawing itself more and more inwardly into itself, and so recovering the pristine potential and potency of the Logos that was and is at the heart of all life and nature. What these passages are telling us is that during the first half of Manvantara, humans were carried by the evolutionary forces. During the second half of Manvantara, humans must consciously exert themselves by self-induced and self-devised efforts to fully participate in the work of the perfection of the human soul, the ultimate goal of spiritual evolution. The central task in this phase of the evolutionary cycle is, therefore, to restore individual initiative. Rather than be buffeted about by the worldly winds of seemingly accidental change, we must engage with the self-conscious task of taking our life into our own hands and directing our intellectual and spiritual evolution towards self-chosen ideals and principles. At this point, we should ask ourselves, what do we mean by spiritual evolution? In the words of the Secret Doctrine, that has to do with the evolution of the human spiritual to the divine spiritual, withdrawing from over-involvement with the sensorium and mundane concerns, developing the ability to ascend to transcendental states of consciousness and meditation, using the innate power of concentration, contemplation, and continuity of consciousness in spirit, not in matter. The complete unfoldment and realization in incarnated life of all the magnificent spiritual powers and potencies carried within the immortal vestures of human beings. Spiritual evolution involves the return to a state of moral purity and mental reliability, unfolding the powers of meditation, of creating purified thought forms for the use of other minds, forms that reflect the archetypal logic of divine mind, which is enhanced by developing an effortless resonance with the minds and hearts of other spiritual aspirants, and thus drawing closer to and becoming attuned to the collective mind and heart, the living center of universal humanity, Mahat. Quote, the mystical seeker concerned to awaken the compassionate, creative capacity of the human faculties must turn from a half-life of outwardness to a full life of inwardness. By progressively withdrawing attention from the phenomenal plane and intensifying the power of concentration combined with viragya, he must detach his mind from the world and the concerns of the separative self. As he does this, the polarity of the linga sharira, the astral form, which is the seat of the subtle sensory powers, will change. There follows a gradual unfoldment from within without, bringing an attunement to the supersensuous spheres of consciousness and a correlative extension and integration of the range and scope of perception. Human beings generally suppose that the five senses we currently use have more or less always been part of the human equipment, that they all somehow appeared together in the human form. Theosophically, this is not the case. We know from our reading of the Secret Doctrine that the development of our five senses are inextricably tied to the development of the cosmic elements: ether, air, fire or light, water, and earth. With the appearance on our plane of each element over time, another of the senses became available for use. Thus, beginning in the first root race in this round, another sense was added to the human complement with the appearance of each subrace. Thus, as the evolutionary impulse brings into being newer subraces, the fundamental perceptual faculty of the ego became fragmented from its primordial unitary condition into a state of differentiated sensory centers. To the extent to which this involutionary development is driven by the acceleration in the mental evolution of the ego, it is a natural fall. However, with the added burden placed upon that involution by an unnatural fixation upon form over essence, there was such a tragic weight upon human spiritual perception that, it is said, the third eye closed, and humans have struggled ever since to recover their primordial purity of spiritual perception, that vast and nearly unlimited ability to stretch the limits of perception. In those very early days, humans experienced a state of near omniscience. As Professor Iyer noted in his essay, Evolution, quote, "In the third root race of the present round, as self-consciousness dawned, humanity was in a state of blissful primordial spirituality. Human beings felt effortlessly at one with one another on the plane of divine ideation, universal compassion, and spiritual will, owing to the extraordinary intensity of spiritual perception. This authentic aboriginal condition of humanity is associated with the eye of Dangma, the third eye of spiritual insight and vision. Despite the self-inflicted damage to our primordial spiritual perception, it is always possible to reverse the impairment and recover those perceptive powers that made early humanity nearly godlike in its effortless capacity for empathy and identification with others, reawakening the true spiritual love of humans for their fellows. The arousal of buddhi through the efforts of self-directed manas is the central task of the current cycle, and this is crucially dependent upon the control of the senses by manas, which can only be accomplished by individuals inserting themselves into the larger perspective of cosmic and cyclic evolution. These teachings of theosophy point to the inextricable identity of individual growth and universal enlightenment. Through deep meditation, each aspirant must acquire a capacity for effortless resonance with the minds and hearts of all other aspirants, and thereby learn to come closer to Mahat, the cosmic mind behind manifested nature and the great hebdomadal heart of all humanity. Without such systematic self-training in personal invulnerability, impermeability to lower titanic forces, and a quickened sense of the immortality of the soul, it is not possible for the Lanu Shravaka to become fully attuned to the collective mind and heart of the human race. It is important to point out that part of this evolutionary work of current humanity is also to rekindle the fires of the ancient mysteries, to create the conditions in which they may flourish as they did prior to their being driven underground around the 5th century BCE. The reemergence of those ancient schools also requires that our civilization become hospitable to those teachers of the mystery doctrines who have always guided humanity and protected the ancient wisdom. As William Quan Judge says in one of his letters, there is a certain object for our general work. It is to start up a new force, a new current in the world, whereby great and long-gone jnanis, or wise ones, will be attracted back to incarnate among men here and there, and thus bring back the true life and the true practices. One of those true practices is the science of astrology, which we know was one of the teachings of the mysteries, safeguarded and perfected over countless ages by the custodians of those schools. Although the details of that science have not been laid out for us systematically in the theosophical teachings, we can confidently state that the zodiacal signs can be seen as aspects of consciousness expressing themselves through certain signs or as symbols of stages of human life. Imagine, if you will, the beginning of life's journey of the soul as something like a treasure hunt. The soul must visit and experience each of the 12 signs of the zodiac, learning and taking away something from each sign. So the soul begins its series of visits with Aries, which would correspond with the newborn baby who sees the world subjectively, entirely in terms of its own being. Then it moves on to Taurus. This suggests a growing awareness of the world in relation to oneself. When it arrives in Gemini, it relates to play and the development of the capacity to articulate one's newly discovered knowledge. In Cancer, connected with the moon, it goes through adolescence and emotional turbulence. When it moves on to Leo, the individual attempts to stand on his own 2 feet and assert his own sense of identity. But in Virgo, it is accompanied by a willingness to learn and serve and marks a maturing corrective stage. In Libra, it has the opportunity to learn balance, corresponding to finding one's place in the scheme of things. And in Scorpio, the soul can bring a high level of continuity to one's endeavors and their successful results. Then in Sagittarius, it can develop a steady will to improve. In Capricorn, one achieves practical accomplishments on the basis of common standards. And in Aquarius, the soul gains a perspective marked by fairness and balance. But the child also has to transit Pisces, which involves the expression of the fruits of one's entire journey, one's discovery of ultimate meanings. Imagine further that the soul did not learn everything it needed to learn during this journey, but got distracted by various attractions and different astrological signs, or forgot what it was supposed to be doing. So around we go again, and then again, and each sign learning some lessons and in others creating confusion that will require further trips around the whole system to illuminate and resolve them. Some astrologers suggest that the Aquarian age began in the early years of the 20th century in 1902 or thereabouts, while others propose dates extending as far into the future as the 24th century or beyond. If we look at the Aquarian age as still several centuries in the future, then none of what I'm about to say stands as evidence for the advancement of knowledge that took place during the 20th century. If it began in the very early years of the 20th century, then we've already embarked upon the Aquarian age, which everyone has heard about sometime during the past 58 years, as the musical Hair announced the Aquarian age from Broadway in 1967. But what do we know about it? Well, We know that in the early 1900s, there was the triumph of the Wright brothers, who achieved the first successful flight of a heavier-than-air powered aircraft in 1903, leading us to surmise that the Aquarian age is marked by some sort of vertical ascent, whether physically through flight or mentally through rising above old limitations. In the first decades of the Aquarian age, the entire face of the sciences was transformed, and the new alchemists had more than little impact upon society. In 1905, for example, Albert Einstein, a then unknown Swiss patent clerk, wrote a series of articles synthesizing the discoveries of the time with such force and clarity that they immediately created a revolution in theoretical physics and developed the basis of the first empirical confirmation of the physical existence of atoms and molecules. Those advancements were soon followed by many more developments in physics, chemistry, materials science, astronomy, and later in biology. In other words, all the sciences have undergone a tremendous explosion of energy and insight since the Aquarian age began in the very early 1900s. But have human beings kept pace with these developments in consciousness? Undeniably, as the currents of the past have decidedly shifted from an involution into matter to an evolution out of matter, we can no longer maintain our former involvement with form and matter, especially with our unhealthy identification with our physical forms. We can no longer maintain the illusion of being personal, separative selves who are only tangentially connected to nature. On the return journey, our direction of thought must be redirected upwards and outwards towards the higher planes of existence that lie concealed all about us and from which we emerged in the far distant night of time. Thus is the great cycle of Manvantara. But there are also smaller cycles, such as the yugas and the astrological cycles, that we must take into account as they each have their own karmic requirements. Spiritual evolution in the Piscean age could perhaps be best characterized by considering the mission of one of its greatest teachers, Jesus, whose teaching was not a codified doctrine laid out like some 12-step program. It might best be characterized as a current of sacred dialogue and communal exploration, which could lead individuals to the sacred task of the spiritual regeneration of the psyche. 3 of the astrological archetypes of the sign of Pisces are spiritual saviors, compassion, and union with the One. But there is a side to the Piscean age which still casts a large shadow. It is the foolish belief that somehow enlightenment will automatically come to us, descending in a secular or spiritual garb. This shadow is an unfortunate heritage of the Piscean age. During the soul's journey through the 12 zodiacal signs, it is in Pisces that the final movement of dissolution is played out. The influence of Pisces will either bind the soul to the effects of involution, further involvement with form, and the illusion of a separative identity, thus ensuring its rebirth through Aries, the ram, or it will lead to liberation, the complete dissolution of all ties with earthly existence. The period of transition between these cycles is very important, but also disruptive. The movement of the soul from Pisces into Aquarius and from the Piscean age into the Aquarian age involves the 3 astrological archetypes of Aquarius, which are breaking bonds, union with brethren, and transmutation of the lower through the higher. Thus, Aquarius is also bound up with destruction and rebirth, the destruction of worn out and unfit or corrupted political institutions, as well as conceptual schemes that humanity has outgrown or which no longer serve the evolutionary purposes of the soul. As the successful journey through the waters of Aquarius brings the soul to a final and irreversible unification of the higher and lower self, which portends an age still to emerge when it is possible for all human beings to transmute the lower by the higher, Aquarius represents the ideal toward which humanity is currently moving. So what characterizes the essential difference between the Piscean age and the requirements of the Aquarian age? It is quite simply universality of thought. For our guidance in this new age, Madame Blavatsky gathered together a set of ancient axioms, which when published came to be known as Aquarian axioms, which are the cosmic and individual basis for the social and ethical forms of the future, when all men will fully understand that life is built up by the sacrifice of the individual to the whole, which is Aquarian axiom number 1. Which goes on to say, each cell in the living body must sacrifice itself to the perfection of the whole. When it is otherwise, disease and death enforce the lesson. Number 2, harmony is the law of life, discord its shadow. Whence springs suffering, the teacher, the awakener of consciousness. Number 3, to obtain the knowledge of self is a greater achievement than to command the elements or to know the future. Number 4, self-knowledge is unattainable by what men usually call self-analysis. It is not reached by reasoning or any brain powers. Number 5, real self-knowledge is the awakening to consciousness of the divine nature of man. Number 6, will creates intelligently, desire blindly and unconsciously. Number 7, when desire is for the purely abstract, when it has lost all trace or tinge of self, then it has become pure. Number 8, spirituality is not what we understand by the words virtue and goodness. It is the power of perceiving formless spiritual essences. Number 9, the discovery and right use of the true essence of being. This is the whole secret of life. Some are even now writing books on the subject, like the book Awakening to the Mystery of Being. Number 10, you cannot build a temple of truth by hammering dead stones. Its foundations must precipitate themselves like crystals from the solution of life. These are ancient axioms from a compilation made by H.P. Blavatsky in 1890. Thank you for listening.
Porque na vida a gente quer se conhecer pra entre